Hi everyone. In this video we're going to talk about completing the square as it pertains to spheres. So when you write the equation of a sphere, there's lots of different ways to write it, but one form is called standard form. And if you write it in standard form, then you can do things like find the center and radius and so on. And in order to write the equation in standard form, we're going to have to know how to complete the square. So that's what this video is about. All right, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to get good at multiplying things out that look like this. Okay, so let's make sure you understand the kind of problem I'm working on right now. So inside the parentheses, there's two terms. Okay, so we have a term here, another term here. In between there's a plus or a minus. We'll do the minus ones after. And then we're squaring the whole thing. So it's very important that there's exactly two terms in the parentheses with a plus symbol or a minus symbol in between, and we're squaring the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do this problem the long way, and I'm going to do one or two more examples the long way, but the long way is not what I want. The first part of this video, I want to get you to be good and fast at multiplying this out. And by the way, I call this squaring a binomial, because squaring means power 2, and there's two terms in here that makes it a binomial inside the parentheses. Okay, so if you're going to do this problem the long way, what you would do first is, remember, power 2 means you're supposed to write whatever's being raised to the power 2 twice and multiply it. So this means x plus 5 times x plus 5. And we all know how to do this. Let me go ahead and just do it real quick. So you'd have to multiply the x's together, and you get x squared. Then you have to multiply this x over here with the 5 over here. You get 5x. It's positive, so we get plus 5x. Then you'd have to multiply this 5 with this x. That's another plus 5x. And then you'd have to multiply this 5 with this 5. It's positive 5 times positive 5. That's plus 25. And the last thing you would do is these two terms are like terms because they both end with x. So you can combine them and you get 10x for that. And the answer to this is x squared plus 10x plus 25. Okay, so that would be the answer. And in general, I want to get really fast at doing this without showing all the steps. I want you to basically go from the question here to the answer here. Just go straight from there to there. So we're going to have to memorize a rule, which I'll give you in a second. But let me just show you one more example real quick. So in this example here, I'm going to put just letters. So we'll do x plus a in the parentheses and squared. So one more time, we have two terms in the parentheses being added, and we're squaring the whole thing. So again, if you were going to show the work would go like this. You'd have to write the parentheses twice and multiply it out. That means you have to distribute the x. You have to multiply the x with this x, which gives you x squared. Then you have to multiply the x with the a, which would be plus. Now, it doesn't really matter what order you write things in, but normally we write things in alphabetical order, so I'll write plus ax. And then you have to multiply this a with this x, gives you another plus ax. And then you multiply this a with this a, would give you an a squared plus a squared. And once again, these two terms have the same ending. So you can combine those and you would get, okay, so the first term, x squared, copy it down. Ax plus ax, the numbers in the front are 1. So you're basically, well, since the terms have the same ending, that will be the ending of the answer. So the ending, they both end with ax. So the answer ends with ax, and the number in the front of both is 1. So you have to do 1 plus 1, you would get a 2. So plus 2ax, and then plus a squared. So you get that. Okay, so I want to stare at these real quick. Here's the answer to that one. So we can come up with a way of doing it faster. Now, what I'm about to tell you, there's no math reason behind it. I'm trying to come up with a way of staring at this, and so I want to stare at it and come up with a way to get the answer really fast. So if you look at the second one here, if you look at this for a second. Well, you notice that when we multiplied it out, the answer, so here's the answer, has 3 terms in it. So that's the first thing you should remember. The answer has 3 terms. So how do we get each of the terms? Well, the way I'm going to memorize it is the first thing you do is you square the first term, because if you square the first term, you get that. Notice up on top, same thing. If you square the first term, you get the first term here. You can get the last term by squaring the last term. So if you square this, you get that. Same thing here. If you square the 5, So square the 5, you get 25. And then since you just remembered that there's 3 terms, you just have to remember how to get the third term. The way you get the third term, again, this is just a way to memorize it. It's not like, well, why is it that way? If you're looking for an explanation of why the answer is the way it is, I've just shown it to you by doing it the correct way, multiplying it out and all that. I'm just trying to come up with a fast way of remembering how to get the middle term. The way I get the middle term is I just take all 3 pieces. Notice there's this piece here and this piece, the 2 things that are being added, and this thing here, and I multiply them all together. What is 2 times a? That's 2a. And what's 2a times x? 2ax. Okay, you just multiply the 2 and the a and the x, and just, you can write it in any order, but like I said, you're supposed to put it alphabetically, and if there's a number, you should write it first. So that's why I wrote the 2 first, then the a, then the x, 2ax. Similarly up here, do 2 times 5, what do you get? You get 10, and then 10 times x, 10x. So that's just a quick way of remembering how to get the answer. Okay, so let's practice that a little bit so we can get fast at it. Okay, so let's go ahead and calculate x plus 7 squared. Okay, so once again, I want to multiply this out, but I want to do it the fast way now. So you remember there's 3 terms. The first term, you square the first term. So the first term is going to be x squared. Whatever's written first in the parentheses, you square it. The last term, you square the last term. So you have to square the 7. I'm just going to go ahead and write plus 7 squared. It's plus because we're squaring. Okay, so if you look at this as 7 or as plus 7, either way, if you square 7 or plus 7, you get a positive answer, plus 7 squared. I know it's 49. Let me go ahead and write that in the next step. Okay, so you square the last term to get the last term. Now, to get the middle term, what you do is you're going to multiply the 2 times the 7. I'm not saying square it, I'm saying multiply it. Do 2 times 7. What is 2 times 7? It's 14. And then do 14 times the x, and you get 14x. That's the middle term. And then this is going to be a plus sign over here. We're going to do a problem in a minute where it's a minus sign instead. So I guess I should clean it up so it makes a little more sense here. The first term and last term are always going to be positive because we're squaring things. The middle term could be negative, but in this problem it's not. Because it's basically like I'm doing 2 times positive 7, that's positive, and then times x. So if there's a minus here, which we'll see in a few minutes, then it would have been 2 times negative 7. We'd get a negative answer here. At least that's the answer to that. If you want to square the 7, you get x squared plus 14x plus 49. Okay, so I want you to practice problems like that and get really fast at it. Let's do one more real quick. Okay, so I'm going to look at something a little more complicated. 2x squared plus 8xy all squared. Okay, again, I want you to notice the type of problem that we're working on. Because what I'm telling you doesn't work all the time. There has to be only 2 terms in the parentheses. So here the 2 terms are. They could be nasty looking, but 2 terms in the parentheses. There must be an addition or subtraction in the middle, and we're squaring it. Okay, if this is any power other than 2, forget everything I'm saying. If there's more than 2 terms in the parentheses, forget what I'm saying. There has to be exactly 2 terms. For now, I've only talked about adding, but it could be subtracting in the middle, and it has to be power 2 outside the parentheses. And then you remember you're going to get 3 terms. Okay, so to get the first term, you square the first term. So you'd have to do, since it's a nastier mess than just x, I have to put in parentheses. So it'd be 2x squared squared. So whatever the first term is, you square that. To get the last term, you square the last term. It'd be plus. Remember, it's plus because we're squaring. Whatever the last term is, squared. So again, I have to put in parentheses because it's not just a single number or anything. So that's squared. And then to get the middle term, remember the way you're going to do it. You're going to multiply this times this times this. The order is not really going to matter, and I'm not going to waste the time multiplying it all out, but basically what it is, it's plus. Again, it's plus because, well, okay, I'm really doing 2 times this. I'm including the plus sign there, but notice that it's a positive answer, and then times that. So it's, the middle term is going to be 2 times 2x squared times 8xy. Make some room here. 8xy, and then again, the last term was the last term squared. So one more time, I need you to memorize something like that so you can get fast at it. So one more time. When you're squaring a sum of two terms, how many terms do you get? You get 3 terms. To get the first term, you square whatever the first term is here. To get the last term, you square the last term, including the plus sign. Square the last term and put that here. And then to get the middle term, you don't square anything, you multiply. So you're going to do 2 times that times that. That all goes in the middle. And again, because there's no negative signs anywhere, we get a plus here. I know this can be simplified, but that's way past what I want to talk about, so you can simplify it on your own if you're dying to know the answer. Let's go ahead and move on. Basically what I want to do now is do the same exact thing, but talk about what does it look like if we're subtracting. So let's just take a look at this real quick. Let's say it was x minus a squared. So the difference here is that there's a difference. Okay, so we have 2 terms in the parentheses with a subtraction in the middle, and we're squaring the whole thing. I'm gonna do it the long way once, so you see what happens. So the long way is you would write it out twice and multiply. When you multiply the x's together, you get x squared. When you multiply x times minus a, you get minus ax. Again, I wrote in alphabetical order. And again, notice it's negative because it's x, which doesn't have a sign in front. That means it's positive. And it's times negative a. So we're multiplying a positive or negative. We get a negative. Then you multiply a negative a times x. You get another minus ax. And then you multiply the minus a with the minus a. Since they're both minus, you're going to get a positive. So it's plus a squared. Be careful, the ax's in the middle do not cancel. They both have negative 1s in front of them. So when you combine them, you're going to get a negative 2. So it becomes x squared minus 2ax plus a squared. At least I'm showing you the long way so you can see where things come from. But again, I want to get faster at this. So let's come up with a rule to memorize how to get from the question here to the answer right away without showing the other steps. So once again, what's the situation? We have to have 2 things in the parentheses with a plus or a minus. Notice we have these 2 things, this and this, with a minus in the middle, and then we're squaring it. This has to be a power 2. Then what's the rule for you to remember so you can multiply it out really fast? Well, to get the first term of your answer here, you have to square the first term. So you square the x, and you get the first term of the answer. To get the last term of the answer, you square the last term. When you square the last term, you might say, well, am I squaring a or am I squaring negative a? The answer is, well, I guess technically you are squaring the negative a, but either way, it's going to be positive. If you square the a, it's going to be a squared. If you square negative a, the negative is going to get squared, so it's going to be positive. So that's how you get the last term, including the plus sign here. The middle term is the one that's a little tricky, but not very tricky. So again, if we use the rule that I gave you for the addition one, we can use the exact same rule. To get the middle term, you do 2 times negative a times x. You basically multiply everything together. Don't forget the negative sign. 2 times negative a is negative 2a, and then times x is negative 2ax. So you get negative 2ax. The only difference is you have this minus sign now when there's a minus sign here. That's basically it. Okay, let's do a couple of examples real quick so we can get fast at this. So for example, if I wanted to multiply out something like x minus 3 squared, again, I want you to notice that there are 2 terms in the parentheses and a minus in the middle, and we're squaring. So we have to have that whole situation. Only 2 terms in the parentheses, separated by a plus or a minus. In this case, we're talking about minus right now. And outside the parentheses has to be power 2. Cannot be any other power besides power 2. Then we're going to get how many terms? We're going to get 3 terms. To get the first term, you square the first term. So you square the x and you get x squared. To get the last term, you square the last term. Again, don't worry about if you're squaring the minus or not because it's going to be positive. It's going to be plus 3 squared. That's the last term. You can go ahead and skip it and just write plus 9, but I want to make sure you understand the thought process here. And then to get the middle term, again, I'm just giving you a way to remember it. I want you to take the number 2, multiply by negative 3, don't forget the negative, 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. I'm not asking you to square it. I'm asking you to multiply it. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. And then multiply by x. Negative 6 times x, negative 6x. And see, that's the answer. Okay, you can go ahead and write 9 instead of 3 squared if you want. But that is the answer to that one. Okay, without showing all the work. And again, you don't even have to show me this step. If you can do it, just go straight to this answer here. Get really fast at squaring these things. Okay, let's do one more real quick. Do a little bit of erasing here. Okay, so let's say I wanted to do 1/2 xy plus, oh, we wanted to do minus, sorry. Minus 9z squared. All of that squared. Again, this fits the situation we're talking about because we have two terms in the parentheses. We have this term and this term separated by a minus sign, and then we're squaring the whole thing. So instead of foiling it all out, distributing it, writing it twice, you're just going to write down the answer. Remember, there's going to be 3 terms. The first term you get by squaring the first term. Again, since it's a bigger mess than just an x, you're going to write the whole thing down in a parentheses and then square it. So that's, you square the first term. To get the last term, you're going to square the last term. Now again, do you need to include the minus sign or not? The answer is it doesn't matter because the minus sign is going to be squared away anyway. So I'm not even going to write it. So we're just going to have plus, and it's going to be 9z squared. We're going to write the 9z squared in parentheses, squared. Okay, and then to get the middle term, remember how you're going to do the middle term. The middle term, it definitely does matter that there's a minus in the middle here, so don't forget to include it. You're going to do 2 times each of these terms. I'm going to write 2 times this times this. Now I don't want to write this thing with the minus signs, so I'll just realize that the answer is negative. Okay, because we have no sign in the front, so there's positive there. No sign there, so it's positive there. And over here, we have a negative sign in the front, so we're going to get a negative. So I'm just going to write the negative first, and then write everything else. So I'm going to write down the 2, and then in parentheses, we're going to multiply the half xy, and then another parentheses, 9z squared. You can also just memorize that when there's a minus here, the second term is going to be minus. When the first term, when the middle symbol here is plus, then you have a plus in the middle here. And again, I'm not going to go ahead and continue this problem because that's beyond what I want to talk about. I just want you to remember the kind of structure, the way you structure everything. Square the first term, that's the first term. Square the last term, that's the last term. And the way you get the middle term is by multiplying. You multiply that times that times that. And don't forget how to deal with the sign in the middle there. This sign is always the sign of the middle term here. And this sign is always positive. Always positive. Okay. So at this point of the video now, we can go ahead and start talking about completing the square. I'm going to assume from this point on that you're good and fast at multiplying things like this out. So if you're not, practice a couple more before you go on to the next part of the video. Okay, so here's one of the formulas that I gave you a little while ago. And I want you to look at this because if you look at the left side, this is something being squared. If you multiply it out, you get this. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go backwards. I'm going to give you something like this that's already multiplied out, and I want you to go to here. Oh, that's called completing the square, where you turn it into something squared. Completing the square basically means you want to turn whatever I give you into something squared. It's a little more than that because the number over here might not be right, but you basically what it really is what number do you have to put here so that this can be rewritten as something squared. That's what completing the square is. Let me take a look at a quick example here. So let's just look at x plus 3 squared. If you multiply this out really fast, what do you get? Well, you get x squared. That's square the first term. The middle term, it's 2 times 3, which is 6 times x, so 6x plus, and then the last term, when you square the 3, you get 9. So you get that. So again, this is written as a square here. and this is multiplied out. So if I give you something like this, I want you to rewrite it as something squared. That's what completing the square means. Normally, however, the last number is not given. So basically what you need to do is you need to come up with what's the correct number to put here so that this whole mess here becomes something squared. So I might say something like, okay, if you have something like x squared plus 6x, what would you have to put here so that I can write it as something squared? That's what completing the square means. So I want to take a look at this so you can see what the number has to be. I know you can see that the number has to be 9, but in general, how can you figure out that number? So let's go ahead and look back at the top real quick. So what you're going to be given is you're going to be given two terms. One term is going to be just an x squared, and the other term is going to be an x term. Take a look over here, x squared and an x term. So there's a number in front of the x, but x squared and an x term, that's all you're going to be given. And you have to come up with the right number to put here. So how could you come up with it? Well, I want you to take a look at this. Okay, so if you look at this x term here, the number that's in the front of the x is 2a. Take a look at that. So 2a is the number in front of the x. And once you see that number, how can you figure out this number? Well, how can you go from this thing that I've boxed in red here to this thing I've circled in red? Well, you take the thing that I've boxed. If you divide the thing I've boxed by 2, what do you get? You get a. So if you divide by 2, you get a. And then after you divide by 2, if you square it, you get a squared, which is that. And that's basically the idea. So anytime you have two terms being added or subtracted, okay, where one's an x squared term and one's an x term, if you put an appropriate number over here at the end, then it could be turned into something squared. But how do you get the appropriate number? Well, it's all about this x term here. You take the number that's in front of the x, whatever it is, you have to divide it by 2. You can see why you divide by 2. You want to get rid of this 2 here. You divide by 2 and then square it. And then that'll give you the appropriate number over here. Okay. Some erasing here. But you're going to have to memorize that, okay? Because you're not going to be looking at this formula when you do problems. So I need you to remember when you're completing the square, what's the correct number to have for your number term? You need to divide by 2 and then square. So imagine you have some problem and it says x squared plus 4x. And I want to complete the square. I want to put a number at the end over here. So what number should I put there so that this is equal to something squared? Well, the way you do it is first thing you're going to do is you're going to divide the number in the front of x, divide number in front of the x by what? By 2. Always by 2. No matter what the question is, you divide it by 2. So if you do that, you're going to be doing 4 divided by 2, and you get 2. And then what are you going to do with this number? You're going to square it. Square. Square what number? I need to square the number 2. So what do you get? You get 4. Okay, so what that means is if you put the number 4 here, if you would have just put plus 4 here, then this expression, you've completed the square. You've turned it into something that could be written as something squared. And then, of course, the next thing is, well, what is it going to be? Well, the answer is it's always going to be, just take a look over here, it's going to be x plus a squared. It's going to be x plus, which one is a? A is the number you got after you did the first step. So when you divide it by 2, this number 2, that's the number that goes there. So x squared plus 4x is what you're normally given. And the question is going to be, what do you have to put at the end of it so that it becomes something squared? In this case, we said, oh, you have to, if you add 4 to that, it becomes x plus 2 squared. Let's go ahead and try one more like that. So let's say I give you x squared plus, I'll just do plus things for now. So again, almost always this is what you're going to be given. You're going to be given an x squared term and an x term. and they're going to want you to complete the square. What that means is they're going to want you to add or subtract, but it's going to be adding. Add a number at the end of this so that it becomes something squared. So I'm asking you plus what? So what would I have to put where the question mark is so this becomes something squared? And then after you figure out what that number has to be that goes here, then you have to figure out, well, what goes here? Okay, and that's why it's called completing the square. You complete the expression so that it becomes something squared. And I'm telling you the steps. So the first step is you divide the number in front of the x term by 2. Always divide by 2. So you take the number 10 and you divide it by 2 and you get 5. That's not the answer, but okay, so then after you do that, you square the number. So divide by 2 and then square the number in step 1. Okay, so you divide the number in front of the x by 2, you get 5, then you square it. When you square 5, you get 25. That's the number that goes here. If they give you x squared plus 10x, you're saying, well, if I would have added the number 25, now it's going to become something squared. The next part is, how do you figure out what goes in the parentheses? Well, it's always going to be x and then plus this number, the number you got in step 1 before you squared it. Okay, so it's going to be x plus 5. And you can go ahead and check. You can multiply this out the fast way we learned, and you can see that it's this. Okay, let's do one with a minus. Here's the formula with the minus. And again, you can see the same thing. If you multiply it out, if you multiply this thing out, you get this. And now the question is, if I give you this, I'm not going to give you the last term, so I'm going to give you this term and this term. What number would you have to add at the end so that it becomes something squared? And you can see how you get this number one more time. You look at the number in front of the x. In this case, the number in front of the x is negative 2a. There's a negative. We're going to need to use the negative, but check it out. What you would do is if you divide this by 2, okay, so if you take the negative 2a and you divide it by 2, if we use the same rule we had before, you get negative a. And then if you square the negative a, notice that the negative goes away, you get a squared, which is the number over there. So this is just a way to remember how to get the last number. Well, you take the number in front of the x and you do two things to it. First thing you do is you divide it by 2, and then you square it. And whatever answer you get, you're going to add that at the end over here. Always add it at the end. There might be a minus sign here, but you're always going to add at the end. Once you do that, it's going to become something squared, and then of course you have to figure out what that thing is. Okay, let's do another quick example here. Imagine you get some problem where it says x squared minus 12x. And they say complete the square on this thing. What they're basically saying is, I want you to add a number at the end so that this becomes something squared. So what you're going to do is you want to add a number at the end here so that this becomes some mess squared. So how do you figure out the number that goes here? Well, first thing you do is you divide the number in front of x by 2. So you take the number negative 12. Make sure you include the negative. I know it's going to get squared away, but you'll see in a minute why we need it. So you take the number negative 12 and you divide by 2, and you get negative 6. Always divide by 2. And then you square the number negative 6, and you get 36. 36 is the number that you're going to have to add so that it becomes something squared. So erase this now. And if you put plus 36 here, now that this whole expression here is going to become something squared. Okay, well, what is it going to be? What's going to be squared? Well, as I've already said, it's always going to be x plus this number here before you squared it. That's why I make you do it in 2 steps. First, you divide the number in front of the x by 2, write that number down, then square it. Notice when I wrote that number down, it was a negative. Because it was a negative, it's actually going to be a minus. I know I said plus. Plus a negative is just like minus. So it's going to be x minus 6 squared. And again, you can go ahead and check it. You can multiply this whole thing out and see that you get this. Okay, so that's what completing the square means. Let me say it one more time. You're going to have two terms. You're going to have an x squared term and an x term, either being added or subtracted. And they're basically asking you, what number do you have to add here at the end so that this whole mess can be written as something squared? And if you can figure out the number that goes there, you've completed this expression by adding something to it, and it turned it into something squared, so you've completed the square. Okay, so now that we know how to complete the square, why do we care? So this is the standard form for the equation of a sphere. So if you have a sphere and the center is the point HKL, you know, 3 numbers because it's 3 dimensions, and the radius is r, then this is the equation here of the sphere. I want you to notice, take a look at this equation. We have something squared here. We have something else squared here. We have something else squared here. So mess squared, another mess squared, another mess squared, and this is r squared. R squared is not a big deal. It's not exactly what we've been talking about. We've been talking about things like this where there's 2 terms in the parentheses being squared, and the terms have a minus or a plus. In this case, they're all minuses. Okay, so if it's written in this form, if you have an equation of a sphere written in this form, then you can figure out the center right away. There's the x coordinate of the center right there. There's the y coordinate of the center. There's the z coordinate of the center. And then there's the radius. But if it's not written in this form, and you want to get it written in this form, then you need to complete the square. You need to turn whatever you get into something squared, and something squared. Let's take a look at this example real quick. So in this example, here's an equation of a sphere written in standard form. Okay, so again, it's something squared here, something squared here, something squared here. And you can see that the center is, okay, so it's going to be this number 2, the number 5, and then -1. If I confused you there, let me just say it like this. Standard form needs to have minuses in it. So there has to be a minus here, and a minus here, and a minus here. So if there's minuses, then the number after the minus is the coordinate. So see, there's a minus, so that means 2 is the x coordinate. There's a minus here, 5 is the y coordinate. But there isn't a minus here, so that means, well, there's a couple ways of thinking about it. One way to think about it is you could just, so I could just say, okay, whatever sign you see here, do opposite signs. See how it says -2? I put +2. See how it says -5? I put +5. See how it says +1? I put -1. That's one way to see it. Or if you want to see it this way, if you want to see the minus sign, then z plus 1 squared can be written as z minus -1 squared. And then I said you have to see a minus, so whatever is after the minus is the coordinate there. Anyway, and then this is the radius over here. While we're at it, let's go ahead and write. So the radius is the number that's being squared. So the radius is just the 3. Not this, it's not 9. Sometimes people think it's 9. It's the number here that's being squared. But again, if you're given the equation in this form, everything is great. But what if it's not given in standard form? What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go ahead and multiply this out here, so you can see what you get if you multiply this equation out. So I'll do it real fast, since again, I'm assuming you're really good at multiplying things out now. So you would get x squared minus 4x plus 4 when you square this term. Then when we square this term, you get plus y squared minus 10x, no, minus 10y plus 25. Maybe I'm going too fast, can't even read my own writing here. And then when you square the last term, you get z squared plus 2z plus 1 equals 9 over here. Notice this is written in the exact way where that's going to be something squared. The 4 at the end is the exact number you needed at the end so that that becomes something squared. This term over here, it's all y's. That's why when you write it as something squared, it's going to have y's in it instead. And again, the 25 there is the exact correct number to have at the end so that this expression becomes something squared. The third term, if you multiply it out, it's going to have only z's in it. Makes sense because there's only a z up there. And again, the 1 at the end is the exact correct number to have at the end so that this expression here becomes something squared. But most of the time what happens is in problems, they'll give it to you multiplied out, but they won't put the numbers that you need right there perfectly for you. So this 4 and this 25 and this 1, usually they'll take them over to the other side. and they'll write something like this. So x squared minus 4x, skip the plus 4, then plus y squared minus 10y plus z squared plus 2z. And on the other side, if you take 4, 25, and 1, that's 30. If you move it over, it'd be minus 30. 9 minus 30 is negative 21 equals negative 21. And they'll give it to you in this form. So now you have to look at this and go, oh, okay, I need to make that something squared. So what do I have to add to it to make it something squared? You have to do it 3 times because there's 3 letters for the equation of a sphere. So you're going to have to get the x's next to each other, the y's next to each other, the z's next to each other, and each time add to it the correct number so that you can get each of those terms to be something squared. Okay, let's go ahead and look at an example. So it says, show that this equation, x squared plus y squared plus z squared minus 2x minus 4y plus 8z equals 15 is a sphere, and then find the center and radius. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to go ahead and complete the square. And again, the way we're going to complete the square 3 times because there's 3 letters. So what you want to do is you want to start off by getting all the x terms next to each other, then the y terms next to each other, then the z terms next to each other, and then go ahead and supply the number that you need to make them something squared. So if I just move things around, let me write the x terms first. X squared minus 2x. We're going to have to add a number to this in a minute, so I'm going to just leave some space for now. And then let's go ahead and write down the y terms. Plus y squared minus 4y. I'm going to leave some more space because we're going to add the number to that in a minute. And then plus z squared plus 8z, leave a little more space, equals 15. Okay, I want this to be something squared. The way we do it is we have to add a number to it. And we know how to do it. You take the number in front of the x and do 2 things to it. First, you divide it by 2. So take the number in front of the x and divide it by 2. So you get negative 1. And then you're going to square the negative 1. And you get 1. So we're going to add 1 to it. But you can't just add 1 to an equation because you changed the equation. But you can add 1 to it if you add it to both sides. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add 1 right here, but then you have to add 1 over here on the right side of the equation to keep it balanced. I'm out of room, so let me put it there. Okay, so that will become something squared. This whole mess will become something squared in a minute. I'll come back to it though. Okay, now let's look at the y terms. Same thing. I want to know, what do I have to add right there so that this whole thing becomes something squared? And we know the way to do it. First thing you can do is you can divide the number in front of the y. It's a y this time. But you divide the number in front of the y, which is negative 4. You divide it by 2. So you get negative 2. And then you square that answer. So you got to square the negative 2. And when you square it, the negative goes away, and you get 4. So that means the right number to add here is a 4. You add 4 here. But again, you can't just add 4 to the left side of the equation and nothing else, because then you've changed the equation. So I have to add 4 on the right side here like this. Now we'll do the same exact thing with the z's. Before I go to the z's though, let me just say it again. So now this will become something squared. I'll write in a minute. Okay, let's go to the z's. So again, the idea is, what number do I add here so that this whole mess becomes something squared? And we have the procedure for it. First thing you do is take the number in front of the z term and you divide it by 2. So you take the number 8, that's the number in front of the z term, and divide it by 2, so you get 4. And then you square the number 4. And you get 16. So the number I have to add to the end of that expression to make it a perfect square is you have to add 16. So you add 16 here, then you have to add 16 here. Okay, so now that we figured all that out, let's see what this is. So this mess over here, what does it become? It becomes something squared. What is it going to be? It's always going to be x. So because there's x's here, you're going to have an x here. And then what's the number going to be? Remember, if you show me this stuff in 2 steps, it's always going to be the number you got at the end of step 1 before you squared it. So this is going to be x minus 1 squared. And once again, you can multiply this out and see that you get this mess over here. Okay, then plus, let's go to the next term. This mess is something squared. What is it going to be? So you put parentheses squared. Because there's only y's in that term, you're going to start off with a y instead of an x. And then y what? Y minus what? Y plus what? Again, if you show me the two steps for finding the number to add, then it's the number before you squared it, this number -2. So you're going to put the number -2 here. So it's going to end up being y minus 2 there. Plus, okay, this term here again is something squared. So I'm going to put a parentheses squared. And because that term has only z's in it, it's going to start with a z. And then what number goes next to it? Remember, it's always going to be the number here you got at the end of step 1 before you squared it. So 4, because it's positive, you put z plus 4. And on the right, you just go ahead and add these numbers. If you add them, you get 21, 36, you get 36. Okay, so that's 36. But you're supposed to write it as something squared. So 36 is what number squared? So the answer is it's 6 squared. You could write 36, but if you write it as 6 squared, then you can see the radius. Okay, so now that we have that, to finish it off, I'm going to go ahead and write down the center. Remember, there's 3 points for the center. And the quick way to remember it is, again, just to change the sign of the 3 numbers you see in the parentheses. So since I see a -1, I'm going to put a +1. Since I see a -2, I'm going to put a +2. Since I see a +4, I'm going to put a -4. That's the center of the sphere. And then the radius of the sphere, well, again, if you write it in this form, then it's the number under the square. This is the radius right here. So you get 6. Okay, so by writing it in standard form like this, we've shown that this is the equation of a sphere now. And then we can also see that what the radius and center are real easily. Okay, so that's how that one goes. Let's do one more. Okay, show that this equation is also the equation of a sphere, and then find the center and radius. Okay, one thing that I didn't mention until now, and that's why I'm doing this problem, is that when you're completing the square, the x, you look at the x term, right? You take the x term, whatever the number in front is, you divide it by 2. But we never really looked at the x squared term. I just said you have to have an x squared term, or a y squared, or a z squared. You can't have a number in front of it. So you can't have like a 2 in front of your x squared term. Okay? If you do have a number in front of it, well, here's the deal. Whatever number's in front of the x squared, you better have the exact same number in front of the y squared and the exact same number in front of the z squared. The reason is because then you could divide everything by 2 and only have an x squared and a y squared and a z squared. So let me just say for now that if you do a problem like this and you see an x squared, y squared, and z squared, things are good. But if you see numbers in front of those terms, in front of the x squared term, y squared term, z squared term, the number in front has to be the same for all of them. And then there's a few ways to do the problem, but the best way I think is just to divide by that number right away and get rid of it so that you only have x squared, y squared, and z squared. So the very first thing I would do is divide everything by 2. Okay, so if you divide through by 2, you get x squared. So I'm just dividing every single term by 2. X squared plus y squared plus z squared. Divide the other side 2. It's going to become 4x minus 12z. And it's going to be plus 1/2. So we get a fraction. It's not the best thing in the world. We just get one fraction. So it's not so bad. The next thing you want to do is, again, we want to complete the square 3 times. So I want to get the x terms together. In other words, the x squared term and the x term, I want to get them together. Then the y squared term and the y term, I want to get them together. And then the z squared term and the z term, get them together. And for each of those terms, figure out what you have to add so that you can turn them into squares. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this term, and move it over there by minusing the 4x. I'll move this term and move it, take this term and move it over there as well. And just get things to hang out where they belong. So we're going to minus the 4x, so it's going to become x squared minus 4x. I'm going to leave some space. And then plus y squared. There's no y term to go along with that, which is actually good news. Saves us from some work. But then we'll go to the next, so I'll leave some space here. And then plus z squared And then we're moving the minus 12z over, so you have to add it. So it's going to become plus 12z. And then I'll leave some space, and we'll get equals 1/2 over here. Okay. So again, whenever you have an x squared term and an x term, we have to figure out what number to add over here so that it becomes a perfect square. Same thing over here. We have a z squared and a z. So I have to figure out what number to add here to make it a perfect square. This one is already a perfect square, so you don't have to do anything. If it's just a y squared term, if you want to write it like this, it's y minus 0 squared, because that's y squared. So that's the easiest thing in the world if it's just a y squared term. So don't have to touch that one. Okay, I need to erase some stuff. Okay, so pretty much the rest of what I'm going to do now is very similar to the last example. The only thing that was weird here is you had to divide by 2 first, because you can't have numbers in front of the x squared. Okay, so I'm just going to rewrite it here. X squared minus 4x plus y squared, some space, plus z squared plus 12z, some space, equals 1/2. All right. So just to recap now, when you have an x squared term and an x term being added or subtracted, if there's no number in front of the x squared, then you're going to be able to add something to that term so that it becomes something squared. And the way you figure out what number to add is you do 2 things. First, you take the number in front of the x, which is -4, and you divide it by 2. It's very important there's no number in front of the x squared, because if you didn't divide by 2 at the beginning, you might have divided the 8, that's the number in front of the x, by 2. But you have to move it over. You also have to divide by 2. It ended up becoming -4. Okay, so you divide the -4 by 2, and you get -2. Then you're going to square that number, and you get 4. So we have to add 4 to this term. But again, if you add 4 there, you have to add 4 on the other side, because it's an equation. Okay, the y squared term, there's nothing to do. For the z squared term, again, it's very important. There's nothing in front of the z squared. There's no number here. Well, that's good. Then you go in and go through this procedure. First thing you do is you divide the 12 by 2. So you get 6. And then you square the 6. And you get 36. So you have to add 36 here. And then, of course, you have to add 36 here. Okay, and now this is going to become something squared. This already is something squared. And this will become something squared. For the x term, it's going to be something squared. What am I going to write here? Since this has x's in it, it's going to start with x. And then what's the number going to be? Again, it's the answer to what you got at the end of step 1 here. It's this -2. You're going to put that -2 right here. X minus 2 squared. Plus, for the y term, just go ahead and write y minus 0 squared. Some people might ask, do we have to write the 0? Well, if you're going to write in standard form, you should put the 0. Then let's go to the z term. Again, this mess here that I've underlined is now something squared. So I'll put a parentheses there and a square. And it's going to be z, and it's either minus or plus something. What number? It's the number you got after step 1. We got 6. Since it's positive, it's going to be z plus 6 squared. Okay, the right side, you have to add those numbers. It's okay, 36 plus 4 is 40. 40 plus half is 81 over 2. 81 over 2. Well, 81 over 2 is not the nicest number to have there. And I want to write it as something squared. So can you guess what it would go there? Well, if it's 81 over 2, you could take the square root of 81 over 2 and then square it. This is the square root of 81 over 2. So let me just say this again here. This thing, if you add it, it's 81 over 2. So if you do the square root of 81 over 2 squared, you get 81 over 2. Another way to say it is if this is 9, what would you put? You'd put 3 here. How you get the 3? You just kind of take the square root of this. So then just take the square root of this and put it there. That's the idea. Okay, so we've written it in the standard form. So now I see it's the equation of a sphere. And immediately we could figure out what the center is. So the center, again, remember the way to do it. One way is, change the sign of that, change the sign of that, change the sign of that. So it's going to be positive 2. I mean, changing the sign of 0, you just get 0. So you put 0 here. Change the sign of 6, you get -6. So there's the center of the sphere. And the radius is the number here that's being squared. So square root of 81 over 2. That could be simplified. Simplify it if you want. And don't simplify it if you don't want. Doesn't matter. And that is the end of the story. So I hope that made some sense on completing the square. You kind of get where the ideas come from and you understand the procedure for doing it. There's a lot of different situations where you'd want to complete the square, but the only one that we're going to be looking at for a while anyway is completing the square when it comes to writing the equation of a sphere in standard form. But there's other ones, writing the equation of a parabola or a circle, which you've seen in other classes. And then some future ones you'll see in Calc 3. Okay, guys, that is it for today. Study hard, and I'll see you next class.